Where there is no vision, the people perish. Proverbs 29:18. Chapter 1. The New Myth. The myth of the necessary incarnation of God can be understood as man's creative confrontation with the opposites and their synthesis in the self, the wholeness of his personality. That is the goal, which fits man meaningfully into the scheme of creation and at the same time confers meaning upon it. C.G. Jung, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. History and anthropology teach us that the human society cannot long survive unless its members are psychologically contained within a central living myth. Such a myth provides the individual with a reason for being. To the ultimate questions of human existence, it provides answers which satisfy the most developed and discriminating members of the society. And if the creative, intellectual minority is in harmony with the prevailing myth, the other layers of society will follow its lead and may even be spared a direct encounter with the fateful question of the meaning of life. It is evident to thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a viable, functioning myth. Indeed, all the major world cultures are approaching to a greater or lesser extent the state of mythlessness. The breakdown of a central myth is like the shattering of a vessel containing a precious essence. The fluid is spilled and drains away, soaked up by the surrounding undifferentiated matter. Meaning is lost. In its place, primitive and atavistic contents are reactivated. Differentiated values disappear and are replaced by the elemental motivations of power and pleasure. Or else, the individual is exposed to emptiness and despair. With the loss of awareness of a transpersonal reality, the inner and outer anarchies of competing personal desires take over. The loss of a central myth brings about a truly apocalyptic condition that is the state of modern man. Our poets have long recognized this fact. Yeats gave it stark expression in his poem, The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus beauty touches my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? This poem, first published in 1921, is astonishing in the way it succinctly strikes the major themes concerning the current state of the collective psyche. The magic circle of our mandala has broken and meaning has escaped. The falcon ego has lost the link with its creator, releasing primitive levels of the unconscious from control. The ensuing chaos calls forth in compensation the birth of a new central psychic dominant. What will it be? Antichrist? The allusion to the Sphinx suggests that we must once again face the riddle of the Sphinx and ask ourselves most seriously, what is the meaning of life? It is the loss of our containing myth that is the root cause of our current individual and social distress, and nothing less than the discovery of a new central myth will solve the problem for the individual and for society. Indeed, a new myth is in the making, and C.G. Jung was keenly aware of that fact. A Jungian analyst once had the following dream. A temple of vast dimensions was in the process of being built. As far as I could see ahead, behind, right and left, there were incredible numbers of people building on gigantic pillars. I, too, was building on a pillar. The whole building process was in its very beginning, but the foundation was already there. The rest of the building was starting to go up, and I and many others were working on it. Jung was told this dream, and his remark was, "Yes, you know, that is the temple we all build on." We don't know the people because, believe me, they build in India and China and in Russia and all over the world. That is the new religion. You know how long it will take until it's built? About 600 years. Jung was the first to formulate the problem of modern man as mythlessness. As with so many in his discoveries, he found it first of all in himself. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes that after the publication of The Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, he had a moment of unusual clarity. Now you possess a key to mythology and are free to unlock all the gates of the unconscious psyche. But then something whispered in me, why open all the gates? And promptly a question arose of what, after all, I had accomplished. I had explained the myths of people of the past. I had written a book about the hero, the myth in which man has always lived. But in what myth does man live nowadays? In the Christian myth, the answer might be, do you live in it? I asked myself. To be honest, the answer is no. For me, it is not what I live by. Then, do we no longer have any myth? No, evidently we no longer have any myth. But then what is your myth? The myth in which you do live? At this point, the dialogue with myself became uncomfortable, and I stopped thinking. I had reached a dead end. Jung later found his myth, and it is the thesis of this book, that just as Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth. In fact, it is my conviction that as we gain historical perspective, it will become evident that Jung is an epochal man. I mean by this a man whose life inaugurates a new age in cultural history. The epochal man is the first to experience and to articulate fully a new mode of existence. His life thus takes on an objective impersonal meaning. It becomes a paradigm, the prototypical life of the new age, and hence exemplary. Jung was aware of this fact concerning his own life. Speaking of his confrontations with the unconscious, he writes, "It was then that I ceased to belong to myself alone, ceased to have the right to do so. From then on my life belonged to the generality." The fact that Jung's personal life belonged to the generality was demonstrated by the uncanny parallelism between the critical episodes of his inner life and the collective crises of Western civilization. His first major confrontation with the unconscious occurred simultaneously with the collective catastrophe of World War I. From 1914 to 1918, while the nations of Western Christendom were engaged in a brutal external conflict, Jung endured the inner equivalent of the World War, withstanding and integrating the upheaval of the collective unconscious from within. William James had called for a moral equivalent of war. Jung achieved a psychological equivalent of war, by which the conflict of the opposites was contained within the individual psyche. Again, during World War II, Jung had his supreme revelation of the unconscious, his visions of the communio, at the time of grave illness in 1944. By D-Day, although still hospitalized, he was well into convalescence. Almost all the important episodes of Jung's life can be seen as paradigmatic of the new mode of being which is the consequence of living by a new myth. This is not the place to examine Jung's life as a paradigm. We must instead consider the nature of the new myth which he discovered and which released him from his mythless condition. Jung got a glimpse of his new myth while visiting the Pueblo Indians in the southwestern United States in the early part of 1925. He succeeded in gaining the confidence of Mountain Lake, a chief of the Pueblos. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes his conversation with Mountain Lake. Mountain Lake said, "The Americans want to stamp out our religion. Why can they not let us alone? What we do not only for ourselves, but for the Americans also. Yes, we do it for the whole world. Everyone benefits by it." I could observe from his excitement that he was alluding to some extremely important element of his religion. I therefore asked him, "You think, then, that what you do in your religion benefits the whole world?" He replied with great animation, "Of course. If we did not do it, what would become of the world?" and with a significant gesture he pointed to the sun. I felt that we were approaching extremely delicate ground here, verging on the mysteries of the tribe. After all, he said, we are a people who live on the roof of the world. We are the sons of Father's Son, and with our religion we daily help our Father to go across the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. If we were to cease practicing our religion, in 10 years the sun would no longer rise. Then it would be night forever. I then realized on what the dignity, the tranquil composure of the individual Indian was founded. It springs from his being a son of the sun. His life is cosmologically meaningful, for he helps the Father and preserver of all life in his daily rise and descent. This belief of the Pueblos that they help their Father, the Sun, to reach each day and make his transit of the heavens turns out to be a primitive, naive version of Jung's new myth. Later in 1925, while traveling in Africa, Jung had another experience that crystallized the formulation of the myth more explicitly. Jung writes, from Nairobi, we used a small Ford to visit the Athi Plains, a great game preserve. From a low hill in this broad savanna, a magnificent prospect opened out to us. To the very brink of the horizon we saw a gigantic herd of animals, gazelles, antelope, gnu, zebra, warthog, and so on. Grazing, heads nodding, the herds moved forward like slow rivers. There was scarcely any sound save for the melancholy cry of a bird of prey. This was the stillness of the eternal beginning, the world as it had always been, in the state of non-being, for until no one had been present to know that it was this world. I walked away from my companions until I had put them out of sight, and savored the feeling of being eternally alone. There I was now, the first human being to recognize that this was the world, but who did not know that in this moment he had first really created it? There the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. What nature leaves imperfect, the art perfects, says the alchemist. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. This act we usually ascribe to the Creator alone, without considering that in so doing, we view life as a machine calculated down to the last detail, which, along with the human psyche, runs on senselessly, obeying foreknown and predetermined rules. In such a cheerless clockwork fantasy, there is no drama of man, world, and God. There is no new day leading to new shores, but only the dreariness of calculated processes. My old Pueblo friend came to mind. He thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their Father, the Sun, to cross the sky each day. I had envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of my own. Now I knew what it was, and I knew even more, that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that, in fact, he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through millions of years, it would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being down to its unknown end. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being. In answer to Job, he puts it more succinctly. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though from sheer unconsciousness he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. And later, whoever knows God has an effect on him. In his autobiography he writes, man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Neither should he persist in his unconsciousness nor remain identical with the unconscious element of his being, thus evading his destiny, which is to create more and more consciousness. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. It may even be assumed that just as the unconscious affects us, so the increase in our consciousness affects the unconscious. And finally, once the union of the opposites has been experienced, the ambivalence in the image of a nature God or creator God ceases to present difficulties, On the contrary, the myth of the necessary incarnation of God, the essence of the Christian message, can then be understood as man's creative confrontation with the opposites and their synthesis in the self, the wholeness of his personality. The unavoidable internal contradictions in the image of a creator God can be reconciled in the unity and wholeness of the self as the conjunctio oppositorum of the alchemist, or as the uno mystica. In the experience of the self, it is no longer the opposites God and man that are reconciled, as it was before, but rather the opposites within the God image itself. That is the meaning of divine service, of the service which man can render to God, that light may emerge from the darkness, that the Creator may become conscious of his creation, and man conscious of himself. That is the goal, or one goal, which fits man meaningfully into the scheme of creation, and at the same time confers meaning upon it. It is an explanatory myth which has always taken shape within me in the course of the decades. It is a goal I can acknowledge and esteem, and which therefore satisfies me. These are the chief statements Jung has made concerning the emerging new myth. To many, especially those without personal experience of the unconscious, these statements may be hard to comprehend. The remainder of this chapter will be an effort to make the new myth somewhat more understandable. The essential new idea is that the purpose of human life is the creation of consciousness. The key word is consciousness. Unfortunately, the experiential meaning of this term is almost impossible to convey abstractly. As with all fundamental aspects of the psyche, it transcends the grasp of the intellect. An oblique symbolic approach is therefore required. I treat the idea of consciousness more fully in the next chapter. There I speak of the etymology of the word, from which we learn that consciousness and conscience are related, and that the experience of consciousness is made up of two factors, knowing and witness, i.e., knowing the presence of another in a setting of two-ness. Symbolically, the number 2 refers to the opposites. We thus reach the conclusion that consciousness is somehow born out of the experience of opposites, as we shall see. The same conclusion is reached by other means. I understand consciousness to be a substance, a psychic material usually but not always invisible and intangible to the senses. The problem in understanding concerns the word psyche and psychic. Until one has experienced the reality of the psyche, he can follow the discussion no further. Given the experience of psychic reality, one can grasp the idea of psychic substance. All psychic contents have substance, so to speak, if they are experienced as objectively real. What then distinguishes the psychic substance of consciousness? Consciousness is psychic substance connected to an ego, or more precisely, psychic contents which are potential entities become actualized and substantial when they make up connections with an ego, i.e., when they enter an individual's conscious awareness and become an accepted item of that individual's personal responsibility. The process whereby a series of psychic contents, complexes, and archetypal images make connections with an ego and thereby generate the psychic substance of consciousness is called the process of individuation. This process has as its most characteristic feature the encounter of opposites. The first experienced as the ego and the unconscious, the I and the not I, subject and object, myself and the other. Thus we can say that whenever one is experiencing the conflict between contrary attitudes, or when a personal desire or attitude is being contested by an other, either from inside or outside, the possibility of creating a new increment of consciousness exists. Experiences of inner or outer conflict which are resolved creatively and are accompanied by a sense of satisfaction and life enhancement are examples of the creation of consciousness. Such encounters, sought deliberately and reflected upon systematically, are an essential feature of the individuation process, which is a continual Auseinandersetzung yeah, right. Or coming to terms with contents that are other than or opposite to the ego. In alchemy, the philosopher's stone is described as the mediator between opposites. In one text, where the stone has a feminine quality, it says, I am the mediatrix of the elements, making one to agree with another. That which is warm I make cold, and the reverse. That which is dry I make moist, and the reverse. That which is hard I soften, and the reverse. I am the end, and my beloved is the beginning. I am the whole work, and all science is hidden in me. Understood psychologically, this text tells us that in the process of creating consciousness, we shall at first be thrown back and forth between opposing moods and attitudes. Each time the ego identifies with one side of a pair of opposites, the unconscious will confront one with its contrary. Gradually, the individual becomes able to experience opposite viewpoints simultaneously. With this capacity, alchemically speaking, the Philosopher's Stone is born, i.e., consciousness is created. The Philosopher's Stone is often described as the product of the conjunctio of sun and moon. For a man's psychology, the sun corresponds to the conscious psyche and the moon to the unconscious. Thus Jung says, becoming conscious of an unconscious content amounts to its integration in the conscious psyche and is therefore a conjunctio solis et lunae. A number of mythical and symbolic ideas can now be seen as referring to the creation of consciousness. The Gnostic idea of light scattered in the darkness requiring laborious collection is relevant, as is the grand Manichaean image of the zodiac as a vast water wheel which dips under the earth, gathers into its 12 buckets the light trapped in nature, and transports it to the moon and sun. The Kabbalah of Isaac Luria has profound symbolism of the same nature. According to this system, at the beginning of creation, God poured his divine light into bowls or vessels, but some of the vessels could not stand the impact of the light. They broke and the light spilled. Salvation of the world requires recollection of the light and the restitution of the broken vessels. The most outstanding symbolism pertaining to the creation of consciousness is found in alchemy. Although the texts are confused and obscure, the basic idea of alchemy is quite simple. The alchemist must find the right material to start with, the prima materia. He must then subject it to the proper series of transformative operations in the alchemical vessel, and the result will be the production of the mysterious and powerful entity called the Philosopher's Stone. We now know through Jung's profound researches that the alchemical procedure symbolizes the individuation process, and that the Philosopher's Stone represents the realization of the self, i.e., consciousness of wholeness. A crucial feature of the Philosopher's Stone is that it is a union of opposites. It is the product of a conjunctio, often symbolized by the union of the Red King and the White Queen, the King and Queen standing for any or all of the pair of opposites. The alchemical myths tell us that consciousness is created by the union of opposites, and we learn the same lesson from the dreams of individuals. For example, a woman dreamed that she went into an underground cavern that was divided into rooms containing stills and other mysterious-looking chemical apparatus. Two scientists were working over the final process of a prolonged series of experiments, which they hoped to bring to a successful conclusion with her help. The end product was to be in the form of golden crystals, which were to be separated from the mother liquid resulting from the many previous solutions and distillations. While the chemists worked over the vessel, the dreamer and her lover lay together in an adjoining room, their sexual embrace supplying the energy essential for the crystallization of the priceless golden substance. There is an interesting parallel to this dream in an alchemical text. Do you not see that the complexion of a man is formed out of a soul and body? Thus also must you conjoin these, because philosophers, when they prepared matters and conjoined spouses mutually in love with each other, behold, there ascended from them a golden water. The golden crystals and the golden water can be understood as the essence of consciousness synonymous with the self. Contrary to the implication of the erotic imagery, the conjunctio of opposites is not generally a pleasant process. More often it is felt as a crucifixion. The cross represents the union of horizontal and vertical, two contrary directional movements. To be nailed to such a conflict can be scarcely endurable agony. Augustine makes an amazingly explicit identification between the erotic conjunctio and Christ's crucifixion. Like a bridegroom, Christ went forth from his chamber. He went out with a presage of his nuptials into the field of the world. He came to the marriage bed of the cross, and there in mounting it he consummated his marriage, and he joined the woman to himself forever. The union of opposites in the vessel of the ego is the essential feature of the creation of consciousness. Consciousness is the third thing that emerges out of the conflict of two-ness, out of the ego as subject versus the ego as object, out of the ego as active agent versus the ego as passive victim, out of the ego as praiseworthy and God versus the ego as damnable and bad, out of a conflict of mutually exclusive duties. Out of all such paralyzing conflicts can emerge the third transcendent condition, which is a new quantum of consciousness. This way of putting it reveals the fact that the symbolism of the Trinity refers psychologically to the creation of consciousness. Father and Son, like God and man, are opposites which collide on the cross. The Holy Spirit, as the reconciling third, emerges from that collision proceeding from the Father and the Son. Thus the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, can only come after the death of the Son, i.e. consciousness comes as the fruit of the conflict of two-ness. Therefore Christ could say, "It is to your advantage that I go away, for if I do not go away, the Counselor will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. And when he comes, he will convince the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment." The Counselor is the Holy Spirit, who will teach all things and guide man into all the truth. Psychologically, this statement refers to the time when all individual egos will become potential vessels for the transpersonal value of consciousness. As Jung puts it, the future indwelling of the Holy Spirit amounts to a continuing incarnation of God. Christ, as the begotten Son of God and pre-existing mediator, is a firstborn and a divine paradigm which will be followed by further incarnations of the Holy Ghost in the empirical man. The biblical statements regarding the Paraclete thus anticipate the new myth which sees each individual ego as potentially a vessel to carry transpersonal consciousness. What the Lord said about Paul may eventually apply to all. He is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name. The image of the ego as a vessel leads to the important idea of being a carrier of consciousness, i.e., an incarnation of transpersonal meaning. Two main archetypal figures have represented this idea in world culture, namely Buddha and Christ. We are fortunate to have two such figures. With two comes the possibility of comparison and objectivity. As long as there is but one figure embodying supreme value, he can only be worshipped but not understood. With the presence of two, we can discover the separate third thing which they both share. Understanding and greater consciousness then become possible. What Christ and Buddha have in common is the idea of being a carrier of consciousness. Characteristically, the image emerging in the West represents the standpoint of the ego, and the deriving from the East speaks from the standpoint of the self. Together they reveal a pair of opposites. The crucified Christ and the meditating Buddha represent consciousness as agony and consciousness as tranquil bliss, total acceptance of the bondage to matter on the one hand, and total transcendence of the world on the other. United, they picture the two sides of the carrier of consciousness. The idea of the individual as a vessel for consciousness brings to mind the symbolism of the Holy Grail as the container for Christ's blood. The Grail carries the divine essence extracted from Christ by his ultimate experience of the opposites, the conjunctio of crucifixion. In many respects, the blood of Christ corresponds to the Holy Spirit as Paraclete. Just as the Holy Spirit is to be incarnated in the empirical man, so the blood of Christ is to find a containing vessel in the psyche of the individual, thereby creating for itself a Holy Grail. On the basis of our emerging knowledge of the unconscious, the traditional image of God has been enlarged. Traditionally, God has been pictured as all-powerful and all-knowing. Divine providence was seen as guiding all things according to the inscrutable but benevolent divine purpose. The extent of the divine awareness did not receive much attention. The new myth enlarges the God image by introducing explicitly the additional feature of the unconsciousness of God. His omnipotence, omniscience, and divine purpose are not always known to him. He needs man's capacity to know himself in order to know himself. In one sense, this indicates a renewed awareness of the reality of the less differentiated, jealous, and wrathful God of the Old Testament, with whom man must remonstrate. The divine opposites that were separated by Christianity into the eternal antagonists, Christ and Satan, are now beginning to be reunited consciously in the vessel of the modern psyche. The new myth postulates that the created universe and its most exquisite flower, man, make up a vast enterprise for the creation of consciousness, that each individual is a unique experiment in that process, and that the sum total of consciousness created by each individual in his lifetime is deposited as a permanent addition in the collective treasury of the archetypal psyche. Speaking of the psychotherapist, Jung says, "He is not just working for the particular patient who may be quite insignificant, but for himself as well as his own soul. And in so doing, he is perhaps laying an infinitesimal grain in the scales of humanity's soul. Small and invisible as this contribution may be, it is yet an opus magnum." Certain mythical images seem to suggest that accomplishments in the personal, earthly life are transferred to the divine or archetypal realm. For instance, in early Egyptian religion, the dead were thought to be turned into stars or companions of the sun. James Breasted writes, "In the splendor of the mighty heavens the Nile dwellers saw the host of those who had preceded him. Thither they had flown as birds, rising above all foes of the air, and received by Ra as the companions of his celestial bark. They now swept across the sky as eternal stars." A pyramid text describes the translation of the dead king to the heavenly realm in these words: "The king ascends to the sky among the gods dwelling in the sky. Ra gives thee his arm on the stairway to sky. He who knows his place comes, says the god, O pure one, assume thy throne in the bark of Ra, and sail thou to the sky. Sail thou with the imperishable stars, sail thou with the unwearied stars." Similar imagery occurs in Christian symbolism, in which the righteous after resurrection will ascend to heaven. Thus Paul writes, "I will tell you something that has been secret, that we are not all going to die, but we shall all be changed. This will be instantaneous, in the twinkling of an eye. When the last trumpet sounds, it will sound, and the dead will be raised, imperishable, and we shall be changed as well, because our present perishable nature must put on immortality." The figure of the apocalyptic Christ makes a similar promise in Revelation. "He who is victorious, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He shall never leave it. And I will write the name of my God upon him, and the name of the city of my God, that new Jerusalem which is coming down out of heaven from my God in my own name." Understood psychologically, these texts refer to a transfer or translation from the temporal personal life of the ego to the eternal archetypal realm. Presumably, the essential accomplishments of egohood, its total of accumulated consciousness, is deposited by means of a final sublimatio in the collective archetypal treasury of humanity. Jung seems to be saying that the same thing in describing the visions he had when on the verge of death. "I had the feeling that everything was being slowed away. Nevertheless, something remained. It was as if now I carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done. Everything that had happened around me. I consisted of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am." A man's dream shortly before his death presents a similar idea. "I have been set a task nearly too difficult for me. A log of hard and heavy wood lies covered in the forest. I must uncover it, saw or hew from it a circular piece, and then carve through the piece a design. The result is to be preserved at all cost, as representing something no longer recurring and in danger of being lost. At the same time, a tape recording is to be made describing in detail what it is, what it represents, its whole meaning. At the end, the thing itself and the tape are to be given to the public library. Someone says that only the library will know how to prevent the tape from deteriorating within 5 years. I understand the dream is referring to the deposit of an individual's life effort into a collective or transpersonal treasury. The carved object and the tape recording can be considered equivalent since the drawing of the object looks exactly like a reel of recording tape. This would suggest that the difficult task involved the transformation of wood into word, i.e. matter into spirit. Based on the communion of saints, Catholic theology has elaborated the idea of a treasure of merits, which have been accumulated by the lives of Christ and the saints. A Catholic theologian writes, "If merit properly so called is not directly communicable between members of the Christian society, at least satisfaction can be transferred, almost as a man can pay a friend's debt. The infinite satisfaction of our Lord and the superabundant satisfaction of the Virgin Mary and the saints form a treasure which the Church guards and administers, drawing upon it for the payment of the debts remitted to the faithful by indulgences." This theological myth can now be understood as an early formulation, marred by concretistic misapplications of the historical process whereby the psychic accomplishments of individuals are transferred to the collective archetypal psyche. The new myth postulates that no authentic consciousness achieved by the individual is lost. Each increment augments the collective treasury. This will be the modern, more modest version of the idea of having an immortal soul. Milton seems to be dealing with the same idea in this passage from Lycidas. Fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth rise, to scorn delights and live laborious days. But the fair garden when we hope to find, and think to burst out into sudden blaze, comes the blind fury with abhorrent shears, and slits the thin-spun life, but not the praise. Phoebus replied, and touched mine trembling ears, "Fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistening foil set off to the world, nor in broad rumor lies, but lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes, and perfect witness of all judging Jove, as he pronounces lastly on each deed, of so much fame in heaven expect thy need." Fame as here used by Milton corresponds to those fruits of the ego life which are translated to the eternal realm and are deposited in the collective soul. Such a fame does not grow on mortal soil, i.e., does not depend on being known by men, but exists in heaven, the archetypal realm. Fame of this sort corresponds to Milton's description of a good book, the precious lifeblood of a master spirit embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. The fact that our age is a time of death and rebirth for our central myth is indicated by the dreams and upheavals from the unconscious of many individuals. Depth psychotherapists who work with the product of the unconscious are in a unique position to observe the turmoil of the collective psyche. Apocalyptic imagery is not uncommon. Here is one remarkable example of such a dream. I am walking along what appears to be the Palisades, overlooking all of New York City. I am walking with a woman who is unknown to me personally. We are both being led by a man who is our guide. New York City is in a rubble. The world, in fact, has been destroyed as we know it. All of New York City is just one heap of rubble. There are fires everywhere. Thousands of people are running in every direction frantically. The Hudson River has overflowed many areas of the city. Smoke is billowing up everywhere. As far as I can see, the land has been leveled. It was twilight. Fireballs were in the sky, heading for the earth. It was the end of the world. Total destruction of everything that man and his civilization had built up. The cause of this great destruction was a race of great giants, giants who had come from outer space, from the far reaches of the universe. In the middle of the rubble I could see two of them sitting. They were casually scooping up people by the handful and eating them. All this was done with the same nonchalance that we have when we sit down at the table and eat grapes by the handful. The sight was awesome. The giants were not all the same size or quite the same structure. Our guide explained that the giants were from different planets and live harmoniously and peacefully together. The guide also explained that the giants landed in flying saucers. In fact, the Earth as we know it was conceived by this race of giants in the beginning of time as we know it. They cultivated our civilization, like we cultivate vegetables in a hothouse. The earth was their hothouse, so to speak, and now they have returned to reap the fruits they had sown. But there was a special occasion for all this which I wasn't to become aware of till later. I was saved because I had slightly high blood pressure. If I had normal blood pressure, or if my blood pressure was too high, I would have been eaten like almost all the others. Because I have slightly high blood pressure, I am chosen to go through this ordeal, and if I pass the ordeal, I would become like my guide, a saver of souls. We walked for an extraordinary long time, witnessing all the cataclysmic destruction. Then before me I saw a huge golden throne. It was as brilliant as the sun, impossible to view straight on. On the throne sat a king and his queen of the race of giants. They were the intelligences behind the destruction of our planet as I know it. There was something special or extraordinary about them which I didn't become aware of till later. The whole ordeal or task I had to perform, in addition to witnessing the world's destruction, was to climb up this staircase until I was at their level, face to face with them. This was probably in stages. I started climbing. It was long and very difficult. My heart was pounding very hard. I felt frightened but knew I had to accomplish this task. The world and humanity were at stake. I woke up from this dream perspiring heavily. Later I realized that the destruction of the earth by the race of giants was a wedding feast for the newly united king and queen. This was the special occasion and the extraordinary feeling I had about the king and queen. Dreams of this sort will go to make up the scriptures of the new myth. This is not a personal dream and must not be interpreted personalistically. It is a collective dream expressing the state of the collective psyche. 8 days before his death, Jung spoke of having had a vision in which a large part of the world was destroyed, but, he added, thank God not all of it. Years before, he had written of the mood of universal destruction and renewal that has set its mark on our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. The dream I have presented portrays this mood of universal destruction and renewal. Strikingly, it uses the same image of harvest as appears in Revelation, where one angel says to another, "Put your sickle in and reap. Harvest time has come, and the harvest of earth is ripe." Then the one sitting in the clouds set his sickle to work on the earth, and the earth's harvest was reaped. What does it mean to be eaten by giants or to be harvested by angels? It means that one has been swallowed up by archetypal non-human dynamism. The autonomous ego, whose separate stance over and against instinct and archetype is the sine qua non of consciousness, has fallen into a fatal identification with the archetypes. For the individual, this means either psychosis or criminal psychopathy. For a society, it means a structural disintegration and general collective demoralization brought about by loss of the central myth which had supported and justified the burdensome task of being human. In Yeats' words, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So it was in the declining days of the Roman Empire to which Revelation refers, and so it threatens to be today. The dreamer was saved from this fate because he had slightly high blood pressure. This was not an external fact, and there were no personal associations, so we are left with general symbolism. Blood is the life essence, but in particular, it refers to the affect life, desirousness, passion, violence. Passionate intensity is dangerous, as Yeats implies in his phrase, "the blood-dimmed tide is loosed." Too high a blood pressure would perhaps indicate a greater intensity of primitive affect than can be assimilated by the ego. Such a person would be consumed by the primitive archetypal energy on contact with them. Normal blood pressure, on the other hand, suggests a bland lack of reaction to the abnormal times. It is correct for modern man to be disturbed, to have slightly high blood pressure. It indicates his inner alarm system is still intact, and there is some chance for him. His anxiety will spur him to reflection and effort that may be life-saving. A complacent attitude, on the contrary, lulls one into a false sense of security, so one is unprepared for the encounter with the activated collective unconscious, or the invasion of the giant. Climbing up the staircase belongs to the alchemical symbolism of sublimatio. This operation involves the transfer of material from the bottom of the flask to the top through volatilization. Psychologically, it refers to the process whereby personal, particular problems, conflicts, and happenings are understood from a height, from a larger perspective as aspects of a greater process, under the aspects of eternity. Once the staircase has been climbed, the dreamer will meet the enthroned king and queen face to face. This is a profound image of the process of encountering and enduring the union of opposites. It is a laborious task, as the dream makes clear, but it is the only way to avoid being consumed by the activated archetypes. The opposites are initially experienced as painful and paralyzing conflicts, but enduring and working on such conflicts promotes the creation of consciousness and may lead to a glimpse of the self as a conjunctio. As Jung says, all opposites are of God, therefore man must bend to this burden, and in so doing he finds that God in his oppositeness has taken possession of him, incarnated himself in him. He becomes a vessel filled with divine conflict. This is precisely the divine service which man can render to God, and which, according to this dream, is what is required for salvation. Another product of the sublimatio process has come to my attention. It is a woman's vision showing how the history of humanity might look from an immense height and distance. I saw the earth covered by a single great tree, whose multiple roots fed on the inner sun of gold, the lumen naturae. It was a tree whose limbs were made of light, and the branches were lovingly entangled, so that it made of itself a network of beauteous love. And it seems as if it were lifting itself out of the broken seeds of many countless egos who had now allowed the one self to break through. And when one beheld this, the sun and the moon and the planets turned out to be something quite other than one had thought. From what I can make out, the Lord himself was the alchemist, and out of collective swarming and suffering, ignorance and pollution, he was trying the gold. A notable feature of the new myth is its capacity to unify the various current religions of the world. By seeing all functioning religions as living expressions of individuation symbolism, i.e., the process of creating consciousness, an authentic basis is laid for a true ecumenical attitude. The new myth will not be one more religious myth in competition with all the others for man's allegiance. Rather, it will elucidate and verify every functioning religion by giving more conscious and comprehensive expressions to its essential meaning. The new myth can be understood and lived within one of the great religious communities such as Catholic Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, etc., or in some new community yet to be created, or by individuals without specific community connections. This universal application gives it a genuine claim to the term Catholic. For the first time in history, we now have an understanding of man so comprehensive and fundamental that it can be the basis for a unification of the world, first religiously and culturally, and in time politically. When enough individuals are carriers of the consciousness of wholeness, the world itself will become whole. In summary, I have traced the outlines of a new myth which I believe is emerging from the life and work of Jung. This myth is not a faith, but a hypothesis, based on empirical data and consistent with the scientific conscience. The new myth tells us that each individual ego is a crucible for the creation of consciousness, and a vessel to serve as a carrier of that consciousness, i.e., a vessel for the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. The individual psyche is the Holy Grail, made holy by what it contains. Consciousness is a psychic substance which is produced by the experience of the opposites suffered, not blindly, but in living awareness. This experience is the conjunctio, the mysterium conjunctionis, that generates the philosopher's stone which symbolizes consciousness. Each individual is, to a greater or lesser extent, a participant in cosmic creation, one of the buckets in the grand Maniacan wheel of light, who contributes his widow's mite to the cumulative treasury of the archetypal psyche realized. Every human experience, to the extent that it is lived in awareness, augments the sum total of consciousness in the universe. This fact provides the meaning for every experience and gives each individual a role in the ongoing world drama of creation.